Early in this COVID time, public radio invited people to call in and leave messages talking about what new things they were doing at home with their time. And so then they would play several of these messages on any given morning that people had left. And one struck me. This woman said, "During this stay-at-home time, unfortunately, my husband has decided to resume playing the tuba, which he's not done since high school, and it sounds like it. He also assured me that a new reed for his clarinet would stop it from squeaking. That was not true. Thank you. Goodbye." Cracked me up. Thought that was wonderful. And she said it so evenly. There was no consternation in her voice. I think there's something similar maybe going on at our house sometimes. Maybe at your house. When Otis and I sing, I have to get him started, and Julie doesn't join in. And sometimes she leaves the room. So I guess maybe it's like a squeaking clarinet or a tuba that hasn't been practiced for a while. But the point is, during this stay-at-home time, with all this time in one place, some of us feel the need to do something new, something different, just for variety's sake, a little novelty to make life interesting. And some of us feel the need to be productive. And I've heard talk of that. So, how's your novel going? What new language are you learning now? How many projects around the house that had been set off because you didn't have time now have you completed? What have you accomplished in all this time? And if you were to say, well, I've been quiet and still for extended periods of time, that's not so impressive to people. That's not really productive. That's not how we do things. Or is it productive? The gatekeeper opens the gate, and the shepherd calls the sheep by name. He knows the sheep by name and calls them out. And they follow. They follow him because they hear his voice. They recognize that voice. They trust that voice. Others who call the sheep, they will not heed them. Strangers, they'll run away from them because they don't know the voice. They don't trust those other voices, but they trust that one. They know that one. There are others who call to the sheep, who talk to the sheep, who try to get into the pen, who come into the fold by ways other than the gate. They are up to no good, and I want you to know that. John tells us Jesus said something like this to his followers at some point. Now, John, remember, is writing over half a century after the time of Jesus. So almost as many years, maybe as many years as I've been alive later. So things have changed, things have developed. John has an agenda. He has theological, Christological development that has gone on in that time. So keep that in mind whenever you hear or read John's gospel, the latest of the Gospels in the New Testament. And when Jesus says those things to the disciples, he tells us they don't get it. Surprise, surprise, they seldom get it. Do we get it? Do we really understand what he's saying? We try, right? So we take the story and we look at the various parts. Okay, so there are the sheep, and there's a shepherd, and there's a gate, and there's a gatekeeper, and there are thieves and bandits. Those are the main players and positions in the story. And what do we think we know about that? We think we know the sheep. The sheep are who? Well, the sheep are the followers. That would include us. We're the sheep. And the gatekeeper is probably God, yes. The gatekeeper opens the gate and lets the sheep out and trusts them to the shepherd who leads them out, and the shepherd must be Jesus, right? We think, okay, Jesus is a shepherd. And if you read a little bit further on in that particular chapter, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. Okay, so Jesus the shepherd, God the gatekeeper, we're the sheep, and the thieves and the bandits. Now, who would they be? The Romans, perhaps, because that's who they kind of are perceived to be, how they're perceived. They sit on everyone. They bleed the nation dry. They oppress and dominate. Could be them. Could be other leaders of other religious groups, because there's all kinds of different religions going on. And maybe some of them are trying to poach some members from John's community, so they might be the thieves and the bandits, trying to sneak in and drag some sheep away. Maybe it's the wealthy landowners, the families, the powerful families who collaborate with the Romans to fleece the flock, if you will. Maybe they're the thieves and the bandits. That all works. So we've got the story figured out. It's all right there. And we're good. Until Jesus says, what? I am the gate. Oh, wait. And the gate would be sort of the passageway that the sheep leave the pen, the fold, to go out into the pasture to get food and to get some fresh air and some sunshine and to play. And the gate then opens and lets them back in when they need security and safety in the fold. Well, that works. That works for Jesus. That's fitting, right? Okay. So how can he be the gate and the shepherd at the same time? And push it a little bit further, if you go back early in John's gospel, John the Baptist is hanging around with his disciples, and Jesus walks by, and John says, "Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world." So Jesus is the gate and the shepherd and the lamb. Is it any wonder that his disciples don't get it? Because it's really rather confusing and messy. We like things sort of orderly and corresponding, one to one, and that's not the way it works. So we analyze the story further. And remember, in analyzing, the first four letters of the word are A-N-A-L, and that's how we can get with our analyzing, right? So we will talk about the personality traits of different kinds of sheep, or we'll talk about the different types of gates that were used in Jesus' time in the Middle East, or we'll talk about allusions to shepherds in the Hebrew Scripture. And we'll go through all of that, and we analyze and analyze and analyze and take apart and take apart and take apart. And so in the final analysis then, we think, well, we understand this. We have this figured out. We've got a handle on this now. We're good. But is that what's intended? Is that what we really need? Consider how many times in the gospel, and I'm not going to ask you to count, and I don't have in my head how many times, but how many times Jesus uses the phrase, I am. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the bread of life. I am. And remember, I am is always in John's gospel a reference to God. Because way back in the early Hebrew story, Moses is being sent to liberate the people of God from Egypt, and he says, well, who shall I say sent me? I need some credentials, I need some proof. And God says, tell them I am sends you. Tell them life itself. Tell them being itself sends you. Tell them existence is with you. The power of life is with you, and that's who sends you. Okay, so every time Jesus uses that, every time Jesus says, I am, he's speaking about God. He's speaking for God. He's speaking as God in John's gospel. Every time. And there is this wonderful observation in this particular text where it says the shepherd calls the sheep by name. He knows them by name, and they correspondingly know his voice. And they follow that voice. They don't necessarily know where they're going. They don't see the way ahead. They don't have a map. They trust the voice. And what's a voice? It's sound. its breath, its air vibrating at a certain frequency. Paul David talks about that a lot with drumming. And so a voice is this air frequency, this wind, this breath, this spirit, this energy that comes from within and that resonates within. They know his voice. It resonates in here. Itaru Sasaki lives outside of Atsuchi, Japan. In 2010, Itaru's cousin died, and they must have been very close because this death threw him tremendously. And he needed to find a way to grieve. And I think in Japan, perhaps grieving is even harder than it is in our reserved, hold it to yourself society, get over it society. They're even more reserved. And so how, if you are particularly sad about a loss, what do? Well, he went out and found an old-fashioned phone booth. Like the English-style phone booths, they're usually red with the panes of glass, the individual panes of glass. This one was painted white. He bought that phone booth, and he brought it home, and he put it in his garden, which is up on a windy hill that overlooks the Pacific Ocean. There's a rotary phone in this phone booth that is attached to nothing. The phone booth itself is just a private place for conversation, a place where he could go and air out his grief. And he said, because my thoughts could not be relayed over a regular phone, I wanted them to be carried on the wind. I named it the wind telephone. That was in 2010. Well, in 2011, you may remember a disaster struck Japan. There was an earthquake and a tsunami. And Atsuchi, this community that Itaru lives outside of, was virtually swept away, along with numerous other communities on the coast, and thousands of people lost their lives. Well, since then, people have heard about Itaru's wind telephone. And so they have come from all over Japan, some of them driving for hours, to talk to loved ones that they lost in that disaster. Well, in 2016, I think, there was a television crew that was filming how people were dealing with their loss these years after the disaster. And they came to film at this phone booth. And they have their cameras back a ways, a respectful distance, but they have a microphone inside the booth itself. And people know that they're being filmed and that they can be heard. But there seems to be no self-consciousness at all. There's just this honesty. And so there's this farmer, this old guy who comes to talk to his wife. And he has very little to say, but it's so touching. There's this young father who comes and calls his mom and dad and his wife and his little girl. He lost them all. And he talks to them on this phone. And he says, I am so lonely. I miss you so much. I so long to hear your voices again. I so long to hear you. Issei is his little girl. Issei, call me Papa. I built a house. I built another house. Their house was swept away. But it is meaningless. It is so empty without all of you. He said, I'm so lonely. And I'm so sorry. And then he breaks down, just weeping. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. It's overwhelming to hear this. It's so powerful. There's this teenage boy, his name is Ren. And he comes by himself to talk to his dad on the phone. His dad was a truck driver. And on that particular day, the day of the tsunami, his father was sent a different route. He normally wouldn't have been driving along the coast like that, but he was sent that way that day. And the waves swept him away, and nothing was ever found of him. And his son comes and asks him if he's okay. And where he is. And he says, I want to talk to you again. And I miss you. And I've wanted to ask, now this is 5 years after the disaster, I've wanted to ask why you had to die, Dad. Why did my father have to die? It's made me so different than my friends. Well, several weeks later, Ren comes back with his family. His mom, his 14-year-old sister, and his 12-year-old brother. The whole family, they come to this phone booth on this hill overlooking the ocean. They come to talk to their dad, to her husband. And they're anxious. They don't know what to say, and they feel silly at first. And so Ren goes into the phone booth, and he picks up the phone, and he calls Dad. And he says, Dad, we're all here today. I brought everyone. And then he sets the phone down. And they take turns going in. And the daughter, the 14-year-old, she goes in. She has not spoken one word about her father since he was lost. Not a word. She goes into the phone booth, and she immediately starts to weep. She just breaks down crying, and you can barely hear her. She's apologizing to her dad for the time she was disrespectful to him. And she then tells him about school and about playing tennis and how she hopes to be in the top 8 by the end of the season or next season. She's not in the top 8 now, but she hopes to be, and she's going to try her best. And she wonders, who's going to buy me that violin that you promised you would buy me, Dad? I guess I'll have to buy my own. And she tells him about a band that she likes to listen to, that she's really hooked on. And then her little brother, the 12-year-old, takes his turn, and then Mom comes into the phone booth. And she sighs this big sigh, and she says, where to start, what to say? You remember we used to talk on the phone, and one would ask the other, are you still alive? And the other would ask, yes, or would answer, yes, I'm alive. Are you? And that was our password. That was the connection between us. Do you remember that? I can't ask you that now. There was so much we were going to say to each other, so much we were going to do together. Come back, if you can. Come back when you can. All 4 of us, we will be waiting for you. And she hangs up the phone, and she goes out, and her kids gather around her. And she says, we were all about to fall apart. We were so broken. We didn't think we could make it through. And maybe that's why we never talked about Dad until now. But talking to him on the phone today, it changed something. It's different now. The shepherd calls them out. They know his voice, and they respond. It resonates in them. Is that the need that we have in our grief, in our fear, in our loss, in our joy, in our celebration, in our life? The need to connect deeply, to have a place where we can speak and listen and be heard and hear without clutter, without obstruction, honestly, openly, clearly, truly. I am the gate, Jesus says. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am. In every instance, he's talking about God. He's speaking as God. And not God as something or someone out there, but the very breath and substance and energy of life, of being itself, that permeates us and everything. The deep, eternal, resonant connection we have already. And maybe that connection, that resonance we might listen for now in this time, this quiet time, this time staying home, this time maybe between projects and between practicing the tuba. Amen.